Ukraine says Russia is, quote, preparing a large-scale provocation to disrupt the U.S.-led talks to end the war. The new comments come after Russian President Vladimir Putin said this week that Ukraine targeted one of his residences in a drone attack, but U.S. officials say the CIA believes that never happened. Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service posting overnight that it predicts a, quote, armed provocation by the Russia Special Services resulting in significant human casualties, adding to falsify evidence of Ukraine's involvement. It is planned to use fragments of Western-made strike UAVs. UAVs are drones. Joining us now is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. Ambassador, thank you for being here. When you hear Ukraine saying, look, Kremlin is preparing this large-scale attack that is going to have heavy damages for civilians, would that be surprising to you at all that Russia does this to try to derail talks?
No, Sarah. This is what the Russians do. They have lied about, as you just said, they've lied about these attacks, and the CIA called them out. They lied earlier, Sarah. This is a pattern. Putin said when he invaded Crimea in 2014, he said those weren't Russian troops. Well, a couple months later, he admitted that they were Russian troops. And then before he invaded big time, the enormous invasion in 2022, Putin and Lavrov, the foreign minister, said, no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. Well, we know what happened. So the point is, they do lie about these things, and the Ukrainians are right to be careful about another false flag operation.
I'm curious what you think the United States should do, because Ukraine had said, look, this peace plan is 90% ready, according to Zelensky. What should the United States do in response if indeed this attack comes to fruition, Russia attacking Ukraine in a major offensive?
This will demonstrate that the Russians are not serious. We've known this, that they're not serious, but this will further confirm that they're not after peace. They are after Ukraine. And they've said that, Putin has said that over and over. He wants to eliminate Ukraine, destroy Ukraine, have Ukraine capitulate, surrender. That's what they're after. They're not interested in these negotiations. They want to derail these negotiations, and that's what's happening. So, in answer to your question, what do we do, what does the United States do? We continue to work with the Ukrainians and the Europeans to make Ukraine defensible, to make Ukraine able to defend itself, and we put pressure on Putin to come to the table, stop the war, stop the killing.
I do want to talk about Zaporizhzhia for a while. Reuters reported that Putin has told his generals that they've got to keep fighting to capture Zaporizhzhia. And we're seeing reports of Ukrainian forces under intense fire there. If Zaporizhzhia falls to Russia, what does the fallout from that mean?
So the Russians continue to grind forward, and Zaporizhzhia is one place, Pokrovsk is another in Donbass. They are making small gains at great cost, incredible cost. There have been some reports about how the Russians treat their soldiers, and they treat them very badly, and they kill them. They're at great cost. They're grinding forward. In order to take all of Zaporizhzhia and in order to take all of Donetsk, it'll take months, if not a year, before they can do that. So they're making grinding, slow progress. They'll try to continue to do that. We can help the Ukrainians stop that progress by providing them the weapons.
I do want to ask you how concerning it is, though, when analysts say, look, there are towns that are slipping into this gray zone, as they call it, neither fully held nor fully lost by Ukraine. How do you deal with that situation?
You reinforce the Ukrainians. You give the Ukrainians the ability to stop this grinding progress, the grinding movement forward on the part of the Russians. The Ukrainians have demonstrated for 4 years now that they can stop the Russians with given support from the Europeans and from the Americans. They can do this. They don't want soldiers. They don't want American troops on the ground. They want the weapons to be able to stop the Russians. And that's in our interest. That's in the U.S. interest for the Russians not to win, take over Ukraine, threatening the rest of Europe. So what we can do, we can support the Ukrainians with the weapons and put pressure, the economic pressure, enforce the sanctions on Russia so that they don't have the money to keep pushing forward.
The CIA recently assessed Ukraine was not targeting a residence used by Russian President Vladimir Putin, despite his allegations to President Trump that that was the case. But obviously the backdrop of all of this is the ongoing high-level attempts at diplomacy and peace. My question to you is, how do you view the current relationship between battlefield public messaging and diplomatic peace negotiations?
The public messaging on the battlefield by Russia is designed to weaken Ukraine, weaken American support for Ukraine, and divide the Europeans. And so it really doesn't have that much relationship to what's happening on the battlefield. Now, what's happening on the battlefield is strong Ukrainian resistance. But let's understand also that the major objective militarily for the Russians is to shut down Ukrainian traffic out of Odessa and the ports on the Black Sea. And so their movements in Zaporizhia toward Odessa are worrisome indeed. I think we have to keep our eyes on the military situation, Omar, because Putin really has no desire to end this conflict short of obtaining his objectives, which is all of Ukraine. And so he uses this diplomacy to stall, to divide allies, to separate us from our natural interests in Ukraine. And he's going to continue to throw out disinformation of things like efforts to attack his residence. By the way, that was a summer residence that was supposedly attacked, which he wasn't at in any case. It's a pitiful attempt by Russia at disinformation, but we can expect to see more of that. And hopefully the administration will stand very firm behind Ukraine with more support, more sanctions on Russia, enforcing those sanctions, getting funding to Ukraine, and I'd like to see a resumption of U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, especially in the air defense area.
New Russian claims are threatening to further derail efforts to end the war in Ukraine. Russia says 24 people were killed after a Ukrainian drone struck a New Year's Eve party in a Russian-held area of southern Ukraine. CNN has not independently verified this claim. And this comes as Russia remains defiant after U.S. intelligence says Ukraine did not, repeat, not target a home used by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Yesterday, Russia handed over part of what it says is a Ukrainian drone containing data proving Ukraine targeted the Russian home of Putin. Here with me now is CNN military analyst and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel Leighton, thanks so much for joining us. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of actually staging this attack on Putin's own home inside Russia. Russia is vowing it will retaliate against Ukraine. What do you think that response potentially could look like?
Well, this is going to be really interesting, Wolf, because if Russia does retaliate, what they could do is they could launch a mass attack. In fact, Ukrainian intelligence has warned that the Russians are basically preparing to conduct a mass attack where they would have mass civilian casualties on a Ukrainian target.
The Russians have been doing that all the time now.
Exactly. And so this is the thing. The Russians, when it happens, allegedly happens on the Russian side, they raise the issue as an international incident, basically. But when it happens in Ukraine, it becomes so common that you almost become immune to it. You almost become numb to it. And that's basically, there's this real dichotomy here where, on the one hand, the Russians are conducting attacks on civilian targets. The Ukrainians try very hard not to do that. So there's a different way of waging war by each of them. There are situations where Russian civilians have, in fact, been killed or injured in Ukrainian attacks, but they're fairly rare compared to the attacks that Ukraine is suffering at the hands of the Russians.
The Russians have been attacking civilian targets inside Kyiv, the capital, apartment buildings, schools, churches, hospitals. They've been going and just bombing all these various places.
That is correct. And in fact, the latest attacks over the New Year's holiday have been an indication in Kyiv of those kinds of attacks. There's video showing apartment buildings that have been decimated, at least in part, where certain floors are uninhabitable. And that really becomes a problem for the Ukrainians. Plus, of course, we can't forget the infrastructure. The Russians are going after the Ukrainian heating infrastructure, the electricity grid. So they're trying to make life really miserable for the Ukrainians in an effort to break their will.
And Ukrainian forces now say they are under what they call intense pressure in the southern part of the country right now of Ukraine. They say they are vastly outnumbered, and the Russians have taken large swaths of territory the past few weeks alone. How do you expect this to affect what are being described as peace talks?
Yeah, well, I think peace talk is definitely an optimistic term to use in a particular case like this, but it is absolutely true that the Ukrainians are under a lot of pressure, especially in the Zaporizhia region. And what that could mean is that the Russians are, in essence, getting ready to do an encirclement move against Ukrainian positions in the Donbas region. That could be one alternative. The other thing could be that what the Russians are trying to do is make a direct line so that they can go after a place like the city of Dnipro, which is right on the Dnieper River, and that could potentially cut Ukraine in two, and that is something that, of course, the Ukrainians have to guard against very much.
So do you think it's possible this war could come to an end this year, this new year?
It's doubtful, Wolf. I mean, anything is possible, but given the positions of both sides on, as far as their diplomatic positions are concerned, as well as the military situation, I think it is a bit premature to predict that the war is going to end this year.